What's up, everybody? This is going to be the first of a series of recordings where I will be reading and discussing Guy Deleuze's Difference in Repetition, a book that I read at the beginning of this year in 2017 with a group led by a pretty awesome Deleuzian named Levi Bryant, and this was a very difficult text. I've read, I've been reading philosophy for 5 years now. This is the hardest text I've ever read. Harder than Being in Time, harder than Totality Infinity, harder than Of Grammatology. So Heidegger, Levinas, and Derrida got nothing on Deleuze in the way of difficulty, and part of that is because he kind of leaves the tradition in all sorts of interesting ways, and he's practicing uppercase T theory here, which really means he's drawing from a large assortment of disciplines, and so especially his usage of differential calculus in this text is very difficult. But anyway, so what this series is, I'm doing the same thing with Heidegger's Being in Time. I'm doing the same thing with one of Braver's books. The idea is that I read it out loud so that I can listen to it later, right? But I also wanted to make these available to people who are seeing impaired or people who don't have time to sit down and read. And I just want to say, I honestly wonder if there's any use to doing this for other people, if this will ever be appreciated, because it's difficult to read. Well, it's even harder to listen to. But I think that if someone was seriously committed, I can imagine someone who might want to listen to this, and maybe they'd want to listen to parts of it over and over again. I have seen that other people have uploaded parts of A Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze being read out loud. So, and I listened to it. Did I get much out of it? No, but I'm going to keep rereading and keep re-listening. So eventually it'll all seep in, right? And so that's my goal, is to make this accessible to you. But part of how I'm doing it, I think that this helps make it more legal, right? If I'm not just straight reading it, if I'm also kind of discussing it as I go through, I think that helps with legality, but also helps me, and maybe it will help you. For instance, I trip up on some words, and then I find out what the definition is, and I write that in the margins of the book. And it's good. There's a lot that I'm going with my level of understanding, which means that there will be words that I'm saying that I'm not going to be explaining, and the ones that I've written in the margins I will share, and I'll also kind of just whenever I have an insight or something to bring in, I will, and I'm hoping that this will stir dialogue. But anyway, getting back to this text, I will be approaching it in the way that I want to listen to it the most. So I'm starting with the conclusion, and then I'm reading chapter 3. So conclusion, chapter 3, and then going back to the introduction, and then chapters 1 and 2, and then chapters 4 and 5. So these installments will be spread out. They will be far apart. I'll be reading and uploading other things as well, and I'm really just starting with the ones that I want to listen to the most over and over again. And the reason I'll explain is the conclusion is the best summary of everything going on in here. The introduction in chapter 1 none of this makes sense, but it really requires going through the whole thing multiple times. But the conclusion really does. It tells you what he's trying to do, and it takes the gist of each chapter and puts it into simpler form. And I wish I'd known that before reading in the first place, because the way we read it was like introduction, chapter 1, chapter 3, then chapter 2, then 4 and 5. There's different ways of going about it. I will be going about it from conclusion first. Obviously, when they're all set up and all available, you could listen to it in whatever order you want to, and maybe that would be better. But from what I understand, the most popular chapter in Difference and Repetition is chapter 3. It's most popular, it's the most accessible, and you can use it the most. People who practice theory, literary theory, cultural theory, whatever, love to be able to use the concepts. And that is undoubtedly what you're able to do in chapter 3, called The Image of Thought. But if you read chapter 3 and you haven't read the other chapters, and then you go and you use these concepts, if you don't have a strong basis or a firm base understanding of Deleuze, then there's going to be some imposter syndrome accompanying that. And so it's my goal to not really use Deleuze until I really have this strong basis. And so that's why I'm beginning with the conclusion and then going through all these chapters like this, because it's important. And so there are people out there who have a lot of time on their hands who might also be interested in coming along for this ride. So without any further ado, I'll dive right into the text. So yeah, bear with me. Literally, let's do this together. So, Difference and Repetition by Guy Deleuze. Conclusion. And really, he leads off with a sort of thesis statement here, which is pretty great and not always that common with him or with continental philosophy. So, difference is not and cannot be thought in itself, so long as it is subject to the requirements of representation. The question whether it was always subject to these requirements, and for what reasons, must be closely examined. But it appears that pure disparates formed either the celestial beyond of a divine understanding inaccessible to our representative thought, or the infernal and unfathomable for us below of an ocean of dissemblance. In any case, difference in itself appears to exclude any relation between different and different which would allow it to be thought. It seems that it can become thinkable only when tamed, in other words, when subject to the 4 iron collars of representation: identity in the concept, opposition in the predicate, analogy to judgment and resemblance in perception. As Foucault has shown, the classical world of representation is defined by these 4 dimensions which coordinate and measure it. These are the 4 roots of the principle of reason: the identity of the concept, which is reflected in a ratio cognoscendi; the opposition of the predicate, which is developed in a ratio findi; the analogy of judgment, which is distributed in a ratio essendi; and the resemblance of perception, which determines a ratio agendi. Every difference which is not rooted in this way, is an unbounded, uncoordinated, and inorganic difference, too large or too small, not only to be thought, but to exist. Ceasing to be thought, difference is dissipated in non-being. From this, it is concluded that difference in itself remains condemned and must atone or be redeemed under the auspices of a reason which renders it livable and thinkable, and makes it the object of an organic representation. The greatest effort of philosophy was perhaps directed at rendering representation infinite, orgiastic. It is a question of extending representation as far as the too large and the too small of difference, of adding a hitherto unsuspected perspective to representation. In other words, inventing theological, scientific, and aesthetic techniques which allow it to integrate the depth of difference in itself, of allowing representation to conquer the obscure, of allowing it to include the vanishing of difference which is too small and the dismemberment of difference which is too large, of allowing it to capture the power of giddiness, intoxication, and cruelty, and even of death. In short, It is a question of causing a little of Dionysus's blood to flow in the organic veins of Apollo. This effort has always permeated the world of representation. The ultimate wish of the organic is to become orgiastic and to conquer the in itself. But this effort found two culminating moments in Leibniz and Hegel. With the former, representation conquers the infinite because a technique for dealing with the infinitely small captures the smallest difference and its disappearance. With the latter, representation conquers the infinite because a technique for dealing with the infinitely large captures the largest difference and its dismembering. The two are in agreement, since the Hegelian problem is also that of disappearance, while the Leibnizian problem is also that of dismembering. Hegel's technique lies in the movement of contradiction. Difference must attain that point. It must be extended that far. It consists of inscribing the inessential in the essence, and in conquering the infinite with the weapons of a synthetic finite identity. Leibniz's technique lies in the movement we call Weisdiction. It consists in constructing the essence from the inessential, and conquering the finite by means of an infinite analytic identity. Difference must be developed to that point. But what is the point of making representation infinite? It retains all its requirements. All that is discovered is a ground which relates the excess and default of difference to the identical, the similar, the analogous, and the opposed. Reason, that is, sufficient reason, has become the ground which no longer allows anything to escape. Nothing, however, has changed. Difference remains subject to malediction, and all that has happened is the discovery of more subtle and more sublime means to make it atone, or to redeem it and subject it to the categories of representation. Side note, this crash course he's giving us on Hegel and Leibniz and what they do with the too large and too small is going to be unpacked at great length, I believe, in chapter 1. But that all of this stuff having to do with representation and the four shackles or the four collars of representation will be, it's really like what he's trying to unfasten. These four collars he's trying to unfasten throughout the whole process of this text. He thinks that this text will operate as a conceptual device or a tool belt of conceptual devices that he will spend the rest of his career building on, that will be used to help untangle these shackles, so that we'll be able to think difference in itself, pure difference, because he believes that the history of philosophy and of Western development has been one of privileging identity over difference. And this makes more sense in the social realm for us when we think of political difference, like plurality instead of unity. Plurality as a celebration of difference over identity in itself. And but really, that's a concept. I mean, that's a basic idea that his peers had been, or his contemporaries had been, developing in their own philosophies of difference, but that he is trying to go beyond and below and around and develop a metaphysics of pure difference that would allow for truly thinking difference. And so following from this conclusion, we'll be moving into chapter 3, where he sets up the image of thought, how representation with those four shackles operates, and how and really, so like that's what's going on here. So if you're with me this far, that's what he's doing. Whether he succeeds at that or if it's a bunch of bull is up to well, I was going to say it's up to you to decide. It's not up to you. It's not up to me. So it's I mean, he either does or he doesn't. Who knows? But yeah, it's way too soon for me to be able to decide. I have. It's, as you can tell, if you've listened this far, it's pretty hard to follow sometimes. So, anyway, back to it. Thus, Hegelian contradiction appears to push difference to the limit, but this path is a dead end which brings it back to identity, making identity the sufficient condition for difference to exist and be thought. It is only in relation to the identical, as a function of the identical, that contradiction is the greatest difference. The intoxications and giddiness are feigned. The obscure is already clarified from the outset. Nothing shows this more clearly than the insipid monocentricity of the circles in the Hegelian dialectic. Moreover, in another manner, perhaps the same should be said of the condition of convergence in the Leibnizian world. Take a notion such as that of Leibnizian incompossibility. Everyone recognizes that incompossibility is not reducible to contradiction. Incompossibility is not reducible to the identical. It is indeed in this sense that the compossible and the incompossible testify to a specific sufficient reason and to a presence of the infinite, not only in the totality of possible worlds, but in each chosen world. It is more difficult to say in what these new notions consist. It seems to us that compossibility consists uniquely in the following: the condition of a maximum of continuity for a maximum of difference. In other words, a condition of convergence of established series around the singularities of the continuum. Conversely, the incompossibility of worlds is divided in the vicinity of those singularities which give rise to divergent series between themselves. In short, representation may well become infinite. It nevertheless does not acquire the power to affirm either divergence or decentering. It requires a convergent and monocentric world, a world in which one is only apparently intoxicated, in which reason acts the drunkard and sings a Dionysian tune while nonetheless remaining pure reason. The ground or sufficient reason is nothing but a means of allowing the identical to rule over infinity itself, and allowing the continuity of resemblance, the relation of analogy, and the opposition of predicates to invade infinity. This is the originality of sufficient reason. Better to ensure the subjection of difference to the quadpartite yoke. The damage is done not only by the requirement of finite representation, which consists of fixing a propitious moment for difference, neither too large nor too small, in between excess and default, but also by the apparently contrary requirement of infinite representation, which purports to integrate the infinitely large and the infinitely small of difference, excess and default themselves. The entire alternative between finite and infinite applies very badly to difference, because it constitutes only an antinomy of representation. We saw this, moreover, in the case of calculus. Modern finitist interpretations betray the nature of the differential no less than the former infinitist interpretations, because both fail to capture the extra propositional or sub-representative source. In other words, the problem from which the calculus draws its power. I will reread that sentence. We saw this, moreover, in the case of calculus. Modern finitist interpretations betray the nature of the differential no less than the former infinitist interpretations, because both fail to capture the extra propositional or sub-representative source. In other words, the problem from which the calculus draws its power. In addition, the alternative of the small and the large, both uppercased here, the alternative of the small and the large, whether the finite representation which excludes both, or the infinite representation which wants to include both and each within the other, does not, in general, fit difference. The reason is that this alternative expresses only the oscillations of representation with regard to an always dominant identity, or rather the oscillations of the identical with regard to an always rebellious matter, the excess and default of which it sometimes rejects and sometimes tries to integrate. Finally, returning to Leibniz and Hegel and their common attempt to extend representation to infinity, we are not so sure that Leibniz does not go farthest. Not that, of the two, he is not the least theological. His conception of the idea as an ensemble of differential relations and singular points, the manner in which he begins with the inessential and constructs essences in the form of centers of development around singularities, his presentiment of divergences, his procedure of distinction, his approximation to an inverse ratio between the distinct and the clear, all show why the ground rumbles with great power in the case of Leibniz, why the intoxication and giddiness are less feigned in his case, why obscurity is better understood, and the Dionysian shores are closer. What motivated the subordination of difference to the requirements of finite or infinite representation? It is correct to define metaphysics by reference to Platonism, but insufficient to define Platonism by reference to the distinction between essence and appearance. The primary distinction which Plato rigorously establishes is the one between the model and the copy. The copy, however, is far from a simple appearance, since it stands in an internal, spiritual, noological, and ontological relation with the idea or model. Side note, whenever I say idea, it's uppercase I. Idea. Sort of riffing off the Platonic idea, right? So I'll reread that sentence. Two back. The primary distinction which Plato rigorously establishes is the one between the model and the copy. The copy, however, is far from a simple appearance, since it stands in an internal, spiritual, noological, and ontological relation with the idea or model. The second and more profound distinction is the one between the copy itself and the phantasm. It is clear that Plato distinguishes, and even opposes, models and copies only in order to obtain a selective criterion with which to separate copies and simulacra, the former founded upon their relation to the model, while the latter are disqualified because they fail both the test of the copy and the requirements of the model. While there is indeed appearance, it is rather a matter of distinguishing the splendid and well-grounded Apollonian. Okay, starting over on that one too. While there is indeed appearance, it is rather a matter of distinguishing the splendid and well-grounded Apollonian appearances from the other, insinuative, malign, and maleficent appearances which respect the ground no more than the grounded. This Platonic wish to exercise simulacra is what entails the subjection of difference. For the model can be defined only by a positing of identity as the essence of the same, and the copy by an affection of internal resemblance. The copy must itself have an internal relation to being and the true, which is analogous to that of the model. Finally, the copy must be constructed by means of a method which, given two opposed predicates, attributes to it the one which agrees with the model. In all these ways, copies are distinguished by simulacra only by subordinating difference to instances of the same, the similar, the analogous, and the opposed, which once again are the four shackles or the four collars of the dogmatic image of thought or of representation. I'll repeat that sentence. In all these ways, copies are distinguished from simulacra only by subordinating difference to instances of the same, the similar, the analogous, and the opposed. No doubt with Plato these instances are not yet distributed as they will be in the deployed world of representation from Aristotle onwards. Plato inaugurates and initiates because he evolves within a theory of ideas which will allow the deployment of representation. In his case, however, a moral motivation in all its purity is avowed. The will to eliminate simulacra or phantasms has no motivation apart from the moral. What is condemned in the figure of simulacra is the state of free oceanic differences, of nomadic distributions and crowned anarchy, along with all the malice which challenges both the notion of the model and that of the copy. Later, the world of representation will more or less forget the moral origin and presuppositions. These will nevertheless continue to act in the distinction between the originary and the derived, the original and the sequel, the ground and the grounded, which animates the hierarchies of a representative theology by extending the complementarity between model and copy. Representation is a site of transcendental illusion. This illusion comes in several forms, 4 interrelated forms which correspond particularly to thought, sensibility, the idea, and being. In effect, thought is covered over by an image made up of postulates which distort both its operation and its genesis. These postulates culminate in the position of an identical thinking subject, which functions as a principle of identity for concepts in general. A slippage occurs in the transition from the Platonic world to the world of representation, which again is why we can present Plato as the origin or at the crossroads of a decision. The sameness of the Platonic idea which serves as model and is guaranteed by the good gives way to the identity of an originary concept grounded in a thinking subject. The thinking subject brings to the concept its subjective concomitants, memory, recognition, and self-consciousness. Nevertheless, it is the moral vision of the world which is thereby extended and represented in this subjective identity, affirmed as a common sense. When difference is subordinated by the thinking subject to the identity of the concept, even where this identity is synthetic, difference in thought disappears. In other words, what disappears is that difference that thinking makes in thought, that generality of thinking, that profound fracture of the eye which leads it to think only in thinking its own passion and even its own death in the pure and empty form of time. To restore difference in thought is to untie this first knot which consists of representing difference through the identity of the concept and the thinking subject. So we're already going through summary of chapter 3. Side note, we're already going through summary of chapter 3 here in the conclusion. And, I mean, it's beautiful getting a summary like this from him. And there are a few sentences where he's telling us the way that we are untying these different knots of the 4 restraints or shackles of the dogmatic image of thought. And so I'm going to highlight I have highlighted those, and I will be pointing those out here in the audio format. So I will repeat that last sentence because this is the first knot that we untie. To restore difference in thought is to untie this first knot, which consists of representing difference through the identity of the concept and the thinking subject. The second illusion concerns the subordination of difference to resemblance. Given the manner in which it is distributed in representation, resemblance need no longer be just that between copy and model. It can be determined as the resemblance of the diverse sensible to itself in such a way that the identity of the concept should be applicable to it and receive from it, in turn, the possibility of specification. The illusion takes the following form. Difference necessarily tends to be cancelled in the quality which covers it, while at the same time inequality tends to be equalized within the extension in which it is distributed. The theme of quantitative equality or equalization doubles that of qualitative resemblance and assimilation. As we saw, this was the illusion of good sense, complementary to the preceding illusion and its common sense. It is a transcendental illusion because it is entirely true that difference is cancelled qualitatively and in extension. It is nevertheless an illusion, since the nature of difference lies neither in the equality by which it is covered, nor in the extensity by which it is explicated. Difference is intensive, indistinguishable from depth in the form of an non-extensive and non-qualified spatium, the matrix of the unequal and the different. Intensity is not the sensible, but the being of the sensible, where different relates to different. Highlighting the highlighted part here. To restore difference within intensity as the being of the sensible is to untie the second knot, one which subordinates difference to the similar within perception, allowing it to be experienced only on condition that there is an assimilation of diversity taken as raw material for the identical concept. And repeating it once. To restore difference within intensity as the being of the sensible is to untie the second knot, one which subordinates difference to the similar within perception, allowing it to be experienced only on condition that there is an assimilation of diversity taken as raw material for the identical concept. And side note, I will just say that this talk of identity, right? This talk of intensity, is really important. This is a concept developed all throughout this work. Something I would like to do for future read would be to just read all of the sentences in this book that mention intensity, which is one of the wonderful things we can do these days with word searches. There's a pretty awesome series of conversations unpacking various concepts, Deleuzian concepts. And so if you've spent much time searching YouTube for Deleuze stuff, then I'm sure you found it's some old professor who talks about how he's retired, and so now he has time to do this, and then he always uses the indexes at the back of Deleuze's works to find every instance of a given word, whether it's I don't know if he does it. I don't think he does intensity, but he does things like bodies without organs or other important concepts like the rhizome, and then he'll go through and instead of just explaining it to you, or instead of just trying to go through Deleuze's works in a linear order, what he'll do is he'll take one of the concepts and then he'll try to find all the instances of it. And this is a really effective way, especially with Deleuze, of getting an idea for these concepts that can get particularly muddy. And he's using the indexes at the back of the books. I like to use Control F or Command F to be able to search the entire document. So intensity, though, is one of the three parts of Deleuze's metaphysics. And those three parts are the virtual, the intensive, and the extensive. The extensive is the physical, um, spatiotemporal manifestations of things, and the virtual and the intensive are the meeting of these other two elements that produce the extensive. So the virtual, this is a bastardization and should not be taken as taken at its face, but I will just say that you can, for now, think of the virtual as possibility. Though, if you do that, then you'll get everything backwards in some very interesting way that I don't fully understand yet. Now, what that means is that there's this realm of intensive differentiation or intensive differences, intensive differentials, that produces extensive instantiations of what is in the virtual. So that's to say that, like, the virtual, let's say that you drop a ball and there's probably like 15 different ways that it could go, and it's kind of a coin flip the way that it will go. Well, in the virtual, all of those exist, and then in the extensive, it's the way that it actually plays out. My friend Michael Downs likes to use the example that he gets from someone else, I believe, of a crack in the windshield. When the rock hits your windshield and it cracks, there's a particular pattern that emerges. Well, that pattern was already there in a sense. The intensive field there allowed for this particular manifestation of what was virtually contained in the windshield. Now, it could have cracked in other ways. All of those ways that it could have cracked are in the virtual. And then it's important to note that for Deleuze, the real is the virtual, the intensive, and the extensive. We typically take the possible, what is possible, to not be what is real. The real is the actual. The possible is actualized. Well, if we take the virtual to be this realm of like possibilities, then it's important to note that those are all literally real for Deleuze. They're as real as the extensive. The extensive is it's just one instantiation of what's held in the virtual. Though there is a reciprocal determining factor, so that the field of the virtual is changing because it's being impressed on by both the extensive and the intensive. So whenever something does happen in the extensive, I think that it could be said that it shuts off, it can shut off access to areas of the virtual. So, for instance, I am sitting here reading this right now, talking to you right now, but at the end of the day, or at the end of this recording, that will be how this has played out. This evening has played out for me, and therefore the version of this where I went to a nightclub tonight, or went and hung out with a friend, that those realities, those that are real in the virtual, do they turn off? Are those like lights in the virtual that get negated? Are they just not accessible anymore? Are they still real but now just not accessible? And is the fact that they were not actualized then going to have some kind of an interesting effect on my future coordination or navigation of the world and my horizons of possibility? These are important questions. I do not fully understand. This is something we will return to as we find out. Once again, I have read through this once. It's not enough reading through it once. So I'm talking through it with you as a way of trying to learn it. And we will see, especially in chapter 3, I think, but there's also somewhere, I believe, in chapter 5, where this our common sense notions of the possible render reality so that we get it straight up backwards. And so I'm trying to sort through it. It's going to be a process, so bear with me, and if you have any ideas, please comment in the comment section. Sorry about that. Okay, that was more longer-winded than I prefer to be in these. So anyway, cutting back to the second crucial sentence, where this is the second knot that's untied, right? I will read that again before moving on. I'll go back 3 sentences before that. Difference is intensive, indistinguishable from the depth in the form of a non-extensive and non-qualified spatium, the matrix of the unequal and the different. Intensity is not the sensible, but the being of the sensible, where different relates to different. To restore difference within intensity as the being of the sensible is to untie the second knot, one which subordinates difference to the similar within perception, allowing it to be experienced only on condition that there is an assimilation of diversity taken as raw material for the identical concept. The third illusion concerns the negative and the manner in which it subordinates difference to itself, in the form of both limitation and opposition. The second illusion already prepared us for this discovery of a mystification on the part of the negative. It is in quality and extensity that intensity is inverted and appears upside down, and its power of affirming difference is betrayed by the figures of quantitative and qualitative limitation, qualitative and quantitative opposition. Limitation and opposition are first and second dimension surface effects, whereas the living depths, the diagonal, is populated by differences without negation. Beneath the platitude of the negative lies the world of disparateness, the origin of the illusion which subjects difference to the false power of the negative must therefore be sought, not in the sensible world itself, but in that which acts in depth and is incarnated in the sensible world. We have seen that ideas are genuine objectivities, made up of differential elements and relations and provided with a specific mode, namely the problematic. Problems, thus defined, do not designate any ignorance on the part of a thinking subject, any more than they express a conflict, but rather objectively characterize the nature of ideas as such. There is indeed, therefore, a mi-on, which must not be confused with the oik-on, and which means the being of the problematic and not the being of the negative. An expletive ne rather than a negative not. This mi-on is so called because it precedes all affirmation, but is nonetheless completely positive. Problems-ideas are positive multiplicities, full and differentiated positivities described by the process of complete and reciprocal determination which relates problems to their conditions. The positivity of problems is constituted by the fact of being posited, thereby being related to their conditions and fully determined. It is true that, from this point of view, problems give rise to propositions which give effect to them in the form of answers or cases of solution. These propositions in turn represent affirmations, the objects of which are those differences which correspond to the relations and the singularities of the differential field. In this sense, we can establish a distinction between the positive and the affirmative. In other words, between the positivity of ideas understood as differential positings and the affirmations to which they give rise, which incarnate and solve them. With regard to the latter, we should say not only that they are different affirmations, but that they are affirmations of differences, as a consequence of the multiplicity which belongs to each idea. Affirmation, understood as the affirmation of difference, is produced by the positivity of problems understood as differential positings. Multiple affirmation is produced by problematic multiplicity. It is of the essence of affirmation to be in itself multiple and to affirm difference. As for the negative, this is only the shadow cast upon the affirmations produced by a problem. Negation appears alongside affirmation like a powerless double, albeit one which testifies to the existence of another power, that of the effective and persistent problem. Everything, however, is reversed if we begin with the propositions which represent these affirmations in consciousness. For problems-ideas are by nature unconscious. They are extra-propositional and sub-representative, and do not resemble the propositions which represent the affirmations to which they give rise. If we attempt to reconstitute problems in the image or as resembling conscious propositions, then the illusion takes shape. The shadow awakens and appears to acquire a life of its own. It is as though each affirmation referred to its negative, or has sense only by virtue of its negation, while at the same time a generalized negation, an oikon, takes the place of the problem and its meon. Thus begins the long history of the distortion of the dialectic, which culminates with Hegel and consists in substituting the labor of the negative for the play of difference and the differential. Instead of being defined by a non-being, which is the being of problems and questions, the dialectical instance is now defined by a non-being, which is the being of the negative. Now, side note, he is saying non-being with parentheses around the non in the first case, and a non-parenthesized version, but in italics, non-being in the second. So I will just say parentheses non-being, and then I will say italics non-being, so that we can tell the difference between these two just by audio alone. It's confusing what he's trying to do with that. It makes me wonder if he's doing something like Heidegger, where he crosses out being. It's written under erasure, as Derrida would say. But I don't know. So if you know about that, let me know in the comments section. Going back to it. Thus begins the long history of the distortion of the dialectic, which culminates with Hegel and consists in substituting the labor of the negative for the play of difference and the differential. Instead of being defined by a parentheses non-being, which is the being of problems and questions, the dialectical instance is now defined by a italics non-being, which is the being of the negative. The false genesis of affirmation, which takes the form of the negation and is produced by the negative, is substituted for the complementarity of the positive and the affirmative, of differential positing and the affirmation of difference. Furthermore, if the truth be told, none of this would amount to much were it not for the moral presuppositions and practical implications of such a distortion. We have seen all that this valorization of the negative signified, including the conservative spirit of such an enterprise, the platitude of the affirmations supposed to be engendered thereby, and the manner in which we are led away from the most important task, that of determining problems and realizing in them our power of creation and decision. That is why conflicts, oppositions, and contradictions seemed to us to be surface effects and conscious epiphenomena, while the unconscious lived on problems and differences. History progresses not by negation and the negation of negation, but by deciding problems and affirming differences. It is no less bloody and cruel as a result. Only the shadows of history live by negation. The good enter into it with all the power of a posited differential or a difference affirmed. They repel shadows into the shadows and deny only as the consequence of a primary positivity and affirmation. For them, as Nietzsche says, affirmation is primary. It affirms difference, while the negative is only a consequence or a reflection in which affirmation is doubled. That is why real revolutions have the atmosphere of feats. Contradiction is not the weapon of the proletariat, but rather the manner in which the bourgeoisie defends and preserves itself, the shadow behind which it maintains its claim to decide what the problems are. Contradictions are not resolved, they are dissipated by capturing the problem of which they reflect only the shadow. The negative is always a conscious reaction, a distortion of the true agent or actor. As a result, as long as it remains within the limits of representation, philosophy is prey to the theoretical antinomies of consciousness. The choice whether difference must be understood as quantitative limitation or qualitative opposition is no less devoid of sense than that between the small and the large. For whether it is limitation or opposition, difference is unjustly assimilated to a negative non-being. Whence another illusory choice. Either being is full positivity, pure affirmation, but undifferentiated being without difference, or being includes differences. It is uppercase difference, and there is non-being, a being of the negative. All these antinomies are connected and depend upon the same illusion. We must say both that being is full positivity and pure affirmation, and that there is, non-being, which is the being of the problematic and the being of problems and questions, not the being of the negative. In truth, the origin of the antinomies is as follows. Once the nature of the problematic and the multiplicity which defines the idea is misrecognized, once the idea is reduced to the same or even to the identity of a concept, the negative takes wing. Instead of the positive process of determination in the idea, what emerges is a process of opposition of contrary predicates or limitation of primary predicates. To restore the differential to the idea and difference to the affirmation which flows from it is to break the unholy bond which subordinates difference to the negative. He doesn't say, side note, he does not say that this is the way you untie the third shackle, but it is undoubtedly what he's doing in that sentence, because in the next paragraph he moves into the fourth illusion, and he was just explaining how to break an unholy bond. So even though he's not using the same language of untying knots, he's still saying it. So I will reread the last two sentences before we get to that sentence I'm talking about, just to give you the orientation. And yes, so honing in on untying the third knot of the dogmatic image of thought. In truth, the origin of the antinomies is as follows. Once the nature of the problematic and the multiplicity which defines the idea is misrecognized, once the idea is reduced to the same or even to the identity of a concept, the negative takes wing. Instead of the positive process of determination in the idea, what emerges is a process of opposition of contrary predicates or limitation of primary predicates. To restore the differential in the idea, the difference to the affirmation which flows from it, is to break this unholy bond which subordinates difference to the negative. Finally, the fourth illusion concerns the subordination of difference to the analogy of judgment. In effect, the identity of the concept does not yet give us a concrete rule of determination, since it appears only as the identity of an indeterminate concept. Being, or I am, that I am which Kant said was the perception or the feeling of an existence independently of any determination. The ultimate concepts or primary and originary predicates must therefore be posited as determinable. They are recognized by the fact that each maintains an internal relation to being. In this sense, these concepts are analogs, as being is analogous to relation to them and acquires simultaneously the identity of a distributive common sense and that of an ordinal good sense. We have seen how analogy took two forms, which rested not upon equality, but upon the interiority of the relation of judgment. It is not sufficient, therefore, that representation be grounded upon the identity of an indeterminate concept. Identity must itself be represented every time in a certain number of determinable concepts. These originary concepts, in relation to which being is distributive and ordinal, are called categories or genera of being. On the basis of such categories, specific derived concepts can in turn be determined by a method of division, in other words, by the play of contrary predicates within each genus. In this manner, difference is assigned two limits, in the form of two irreducible but complementary figures which indicate precisely its belonging to representation, the large and the small. The categories as a priori concepts and the empirical concepts, the originary determinable concepts and the derived determined concepts, the analogous and the opposed, the large genera and the species. This distribution of difference, in a manner entirely dependent upon the requirements of representation, essentially belongs within the analogical vision of the world. However, this form of distribution commanded by the categories seemed to us to betray the nature of being, as a cardinal and collective concept, and the nature of the distributions themselves, as nomadic rather than sedentary and fixed distributions, as well as the nature of difference, as individuating difference. In terms of this distribution, the individual is only, and only understood as, that which bears differences in general, while being distributes itself among the fixed forms of these differences and is said analogically of that which is. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the four illusions of representation distort repetition no less than they distort difference, and for reasons which are in certain respects comparable. In the first place, representation provides no direct and positive criteria for distinguishing between repetition and the order of generality, resemblance, or equivalence. That is why repetition is represented as a perfect resemblance or an extreme equality. Second, representation in effect invokes the identity of the concept in order to explain repetition no less than to understand difference. Difference is represented in the identical concept, and thereby reduced to a merely conceptual difference. Repetition, by contrast, is represented outside the concept, as though it were a difference without concept, but always with the presupposition of an identical concept. Okay, that was in italics. I try to say it with that edge in my voice whenever it's in italics. So I'm going to reread that sentence, though, because I tripped on it, and also it's apparently important. I'll go 2 sentences back. Second, representation in effect invokes the identity of the concept in order to explain repetition no less than to understand difference. Difference is represented in the identical concept and thereby reduced to a merely conceptual difference. Repetition, by contrast, is represented outside the concept, as though it were a difference without concept, but always with the presupposition of an identical concept. Thus, repetition occurs when things are distinguished in numero, in space and time, while their concept remains the same. In the same movement, therefore, the identity of the concept in representation includes difference and is extended to repetition. A third aspect follows from this. It is apparent that repetition can no longer receive anything but a negative explanation. In effect, it is a matter of explaining the possibility of differences without concept. Or one invokes a logical limitation of the concept at each of its moments. In other words, a relative blockage, such that, however far the comprehension of the concept is pushed, there is always an infinite number of things which can correspond to it, since the fact one can never encompass the infinity of that comprehension which would make every difference a conceptual difference. Repetition is then explained only in terms of a relative limitation in our representation of the concept, and, from precisely this point of view, we deprive ourselves of any means of distinguishing repetition from simple resemblance. Alternatively, a real opposition is invoked, one that is capable of imposing an absolute natural blockage on the concept, by assigning it to a comprehension that is in principle necessarily finite, by defining an order external to the comprehension of an even... Alternatively, a real opposition is invoked, one that is capable of imposing an absolute natural blockage on the concept, by assigning to it a comprehension that is in principle necessarily finite, by defining an order external to the comprehension of even an indefinite concept, or by bringing in forces opposed to the subjective concomitants of the infinite concept, memory, recognition, self-consciousness. We have seen how these three cases seem to be illustrated respectively by nominal concepts, concepts of nature and concepts of freedom, words, nature, and the unconscious. In all these cases, thanks to the distinction between absolute natural blockage and artificial or logical blockage, there is no doubt that we have the means to distinguish between repetition and simple resemblance, since things are said to repeat when they differ even though their concept is absolutely the same. However, not only this distinction, but repetition itself is explained here in an entirely negative fashion. It, language, repeats because it, the words, is not real, because there is no definition other than nominal. It, nature, repeats because it, matter, has no interiority, because it is partes extra partes. I don't know what that means. It's Latin, but it's probably parts extra parts. This seems to be what it says. I'll reread that sentence. It, nature, repeats because it, matter, has no interiority, because it is parts extra parts. It, the unconscious, repeats because it, the ego, represses it, because it, the id, has no memory, no recognition, and no consciousness of itself, ultimately because it has no instinct, instinct being the subjective concomitant of the species as concept. In short, things repeat always by virtue of what they are not and do not have. We repeat because we do not hear. As Kierkegaard said, it is the repetition of the deaf, or rather for the deaf. Deafness of words, deafness of nature, deafness of the unconscious. Within representation, the forces which ensure repetition, in other words, a multiplicity of things for a concept absolutely the same, can only be negatively determined. Fourth, repetition is not only defined in relation to the absolute identity of the concept. It must, in a certain manner, itself represent this identical concept. A phenomenon corresponding to the analogy of judgment emerges here. Repetition is not content with multiplying instances of the same concept. It puts the concept outside itself and causes it to exist in so many instances, hic et nunc, which means here and now. It fragments identity itself, just as Democritus fragmented the one being of Parmenides and multiplied it into atoms. or rather, the multiplication of things under an absolutely identical concept has as its consequence the division of the concept into absolutely identical things. Matter realizes the state of the concept outside itself, or the infinitely repeated element. That is why the model of repetition is indistinguishable from pure matter understood as the fragmentation of the identical, or the repetition of a minimum. Repetition, therefore, has a primary sense from the point of view of representation, namely, that of a material and bare repetition, a repetition of the same, and not only under the same concept. All the other senses will be derived from this extrinsic model. In other words, every time we encounter a variant, a difference, a disguise, or a displacement, we will say that it is a matter of repetition. A disguise or a displacement, we will say that it is a matter of repetition, but only in a derivative and analogical model or manner. In other words, every time we encounter a variant, a difference, a disguise, or a displacement, we will say that it is a matter of repetition, but only in a derivative and analogical manner. Long part in parentheses. Even in the case of Freud, the prodigious conception of repetition in psychic life is dominated not only by a schema of opposition in the case of the theory of repression, but by a material model in that of the death instinct. End parentheses. This extrinsic material model, however, takes repetition as already accomplished and presents it to a spectator who contemplates it from without. It suppresses the thickness in which repetition occurs and unfolds, even in the case of matter and death. Whence the attempt, by contrast, to represent disguise and displacement as the constituent elements of repetition, but on condition that repetition is confounded with analogy itself. Identity is no longer that of an element, but, in accordance with the traditional signification, that of a relation between distinct elements or a relation between relations. Earlier, physical matter provided repetition with its primary sense, and the other senses, biological, psychic, metaphysical, were said by analogy. Now, analogy by itself is the logical matter of repetition, providing it with a distributive sense. However, it is still a sense understood in relation to a thought identity or to a represented equality, with the result that repetition remains a concept of reflection which ensures the distribution and the displacement of terms, the transportation of the element, but only within representation and for a spectator who remains extrinsic. I will repeat the last chunk of that paragraph because I tripped up on a couple words, which I'm pretty sure by doing so change their meaning. Whenever I do that, I'll try to back up. Now, analogy by itself is the logical matter of repetition, providing it with a distributive sense. However, it is still a sense understood in relation to a thought identity or to a represented equality, with the result that repetition remains a concept of reflection which ensures the distribution and the displacement of terms and the transportation of the element, but only within representation and for a spectator who remains extrinsic. Section break. Whew. Looking ahead here, we got only about 32 more pages of this chapter. I will not be finishing this tonight, but I would like to go on a little bit longer. I hope that somebody out there someday gets something from this. I imagine myself in a hospital bed, unable to read, having read this in the past and wishing to revisit it and being able to because I read it out loud and put it on YouTube. So at least the future me that is unable to read a book for whatever reason will be able to. Sorry about the butchering of certain pronunciations. I do believe that for the most part I'm doing pretty good, but some of these I've never had to read out loud. So like Democritus, for instance, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. Tripped up on that though. That stuff a few pages back on the meon and the oikon. The meon is spelled M-E and then on, and the E has a line across the top of it, and I forget what it's called. And I forget what that's supposed to do to the E. And the oikon, it's really like ouk-on, like O-U-K on. And I'm guessing these are Greek, but I don't know anything about them. So I don't think it was that important. I hope it wasn't. But yeah, there's a certain point with these texts where it's like, okay, if that's really important, I'll look it up. And I do look up a lot of these things, but that's one that I never got to. I meant to ask in our discussion section, but I didn't. All right, I'm just talking now. Let's get back to it. To ground is to determine. But what is determination, and upon what is it exercised? Grounding is the operation of the logos, or of sufficient reason. As such, it has three senses. In its first sense, the ground is the same or the identical. It enjoys supreme identity, that which is supposed to belong to ideas, or to the autokathato. What it is and what it possesses, it is and it possesses primarily in the utmost. What, apart from courage, would be courageous or virtuous apart from virtue? What the ground has to ground, therefore, is only the claim of those who come after. All those who at best possess secondarily. It is always a claim or an image that requires a ground or appeals to a ground. For example, the claim of men to be courageous, to be virtuous. In short, to have part or to participate in. Metexin means to have after. As such, we may distinguish between the ground or ideal essence, the grounded in the form of claimant or claim, and that upon which the claim bears. In other words, the quality that the ground possesses primarily and the claimant will possess secondarily, assuming that its claim is well grounded. This quality, the object of the claim, is difference, the fiancé, Ariadne. The essence or ground is the identical in so far as it originally includes the difference of its object. The operation of grounding renders the claimant similar to the ground, endowing it with resemblance from within, and thereby allowing it to participate in the quality of the object which it claims. As similar to the same, the claimant is said to resemble. This, however, is not an external resemblance to the object, but an internal resemblance to the ground itself. In order to have the daughter, one must resemble the father. Difference is thought here in terms of the principle of sameness and the condition of resemblance. Moreover, there will be claimants in third place, fourth place, and fifth place, as many as there are images grounded in the hierarchy of this internal resemblance. That is why the ground selects and establishes the difference between the claimants themselves. Each well-grounded image or claim is called a representation, since the first in the order of claims is still second in itself in relation to the foundation. It is in this sense that ideas inaugurate or ground the world of representation. As for the rebellious images which lack resemblance, simulacra, These are eliminated, rejected, and denounced as ungrounded, false claimants. In a second sense, once the world of representation is established, the ground is no longer defined by the identical. The identical has become the internal character of representation itself, while resemblance has become its external relation with the thing. The identical now expresses a claim which must in turn be grounded, for the object of the claim is no longer difference understood as the quality, but that which is too large or too small in the difference, the excess and the default, in other words, the infinite. What must be grounded is the claim of representation to conquer the infinite, in order that it is indebted to no one for the daughter and capture the heart of difference. It is no longer the image which seeks to conquer difference, as this seemed to be originally included in the identical, but, on the contrary, identity which seeks to conquer that which it does not include of difference. To ground no longer means to inaugurate and render possible representation, but to render representation infinite. The ground must now operate in the heart of representation, in order to extend its limits to both the infinitely small and the infinitely large. This operation is carried out by a method which ensures a monocentricity of all the possible centers of finite representation, a convergence of all the finite points of view of representation. This operation expresses sufficient reason. The latter is not identity, but rather the means of subordinating to the identical and the other requirements of representation that part of difference which escaped them in the first place. Once again, this operation expresses sufficient reason. The latter is not identity, but rather the means of subordinating to the identical and the other requirements of representation that part of difference which escaped them in the first sense. The two senses of the ground are nevertheless united in a third. In effect, to ground is always to bend, to curve and recurve, to organize the order of the seasons, the days, and years. The object of the claim, the quality, difference, finds itself placed in a circle. The arcs of the circle are distinguished to the extent that the ground establishes moments of stasis within qualitative becoming, stoppages in between the two extremes of more and less. The claimants are distributed along the mobile circle, each receiving the lot which corresponds to the worth of its life. A life is here assimilated to a strict present, which stakes its claim upon a portion of the circle, which contracts that portion and draws from it a loss or a gain in the order of more and less according to its own progression or regression in the hierarchy of images. Another present or another life contracts another portion. In Platonism, we see clearly how the rotation of the circle and the distribution of lots, circle and metempsychosis, form a grounding test or lottery. With Hegel again, however, all the possible beginnings and all the presents are distributed within the unique, incessant principle of a grounding circle, which includes these in its center, while it distributes them along its circumference. With Leibniz, too, compossibility itself is a circle of convergence on which are distributed all the points of view, all the presence of which the world is composed. To ground, in this third sense, is to represent the present. In other words, to make the present arrive and pass within representation, finite or infinite. The ground then appears as an immemorial memory or pure past, a past which itself was never present, but which causes the present to pass, and in relation to which all the presents coexist in a circle. To ground is always to ground representation. How, then, are we to explain the ambiguity that is essential to the ground? It is as though it were attracted by the representation that it grounds, in these three senses, while at the same time it is drawn towards a beyond, as though it vacillated between a fall into the grounded and an engulfment in a groundlessness sans fond. We saw this in the case of the memory-ground. It tended to represent itself as a former present and to enter into the circle which it organized in principle. Is this not the more general characteristic of the ground, namely, that the circle which it organizes is also the vicious circle of philosophical proof, in which representation must prove what proves it, just as for Kant the possibility of experience serves as the proof of its own proof? On the other hand, when transcendental memory overcomes its vertigo and maintains the irreducibility of the pure past to any present which passes in representation, it is only to see this pure past dissolve in another manner, and to see unraveled the circle in which it too simply distributes difference and repetition. In this manner, the second synthesis of time which united Eros and Mnemosyne, I'll say. In this manner, the second synthesis of time, which united Eros and Mnemosyne, Eros as a seeker after memories, Mnemosyne as the treasure of the pure past, is overcome or overturned in a third synthesis, one which brings together a desexualized death instinct and an essentially amnesiac narcissistic ego within the form of empty time. Now, I will repeat that sentence because it's crazy. In this manner, the second synthesis of time, which united Eros and Mnemosyne, Eros is the seeker after memories, Mnemosyne as the treasure of the pure past, is overcome or overturned in a third synthesis, one which brings together a desexualized death instinct and an essentially amnesiac narcissistic ego within the form of empty time. Moreover, how can the ground in its other senses be protected from challenge at the hands of the simulacra and all the forces of divergence and decentering which overturn the false distributions and the false repartitions as they do the false circle and the false lottery? The world of the ground is undermined by what it tries to exclude, by the simulacrum which draws it in only to fragment it. When the ground in the first sense appeals to the idea, it is on condition that the latter be attributed an identity that it does not have by itself, but which it derives solely from the requirements of that which it claims to prove. The idea no more implies an identity than its process of actualization is explicated by resemblance. An entire multiplicity rumbles underneath the sameness of the idea. There is no doubt that describing ideas as substantive multiplicities, irreducible to any same or one, showed us how sufficient reason was capable of engendering itself independently of the requirements of representation, along the pathways of the multiple as such, by determining the elements, relations, and singularities corresponding to a given idea in terms of the threefold principle of determinability, reciprocal determination, and complete determination. Upon precisely what ground, however, is this multiple reason engendered and played out? In what unreason is it submerged, and from what new type of game or lottery does it draw its singularities and its distributions, which remain irreducible to all that we have just seen? In short, sufficient reason, or the ground, is strangely bent. On the one hand, it leans towards what it grounds, towards the forms of representation. On the other hand, it turns and plunges into a groundlessness beyond the ground, which resists all forms and cannot be represented. If difference is the fiancé, Ariadne, then it passes from Theseus to Dionysus, from the grounding principle to the universal ungrounding. The fact is that to ground is to determine the indeterminate, but this is not a simple operation. When determination as such occurs, it does not simply provide a form or impart form to a given matter on the basis of the categories. Something of the ground rises to the surface without assuming any form, but rather insinuating itself between the forms, a formless base, an autonomous and faceless existence. The ground which is now on the surface is called depth or groundlessness. Conversely, when they are reflected in it, forms decompose, every model breaks down, and all faces perish, leaving only the abstract line as a determination absolutely adequate to the indeterminate, just as the flash of lightning is equal to the night, acid equal to the base, and distinction adequate to obscurity as a whole. Monstrosity. Parentheses. A determination which is not opposed to the indeterminate and does not limit it. In parentheses. That is why the matter-form couple is not sufficient to describe the mechanism and determination. Matter is already informed. Form is not separable from the model of the species or that of the morph, and the whole is under the protection of the categories. In fact, the couple is completely internal to representation, serving to define its first state as this was established by Aristotle. It is already progress to invoke the complementarity of force and the ground as the sufficient reason of form, matter, and the reunion. More profound and threatening still is the couple formed by the abstract line and the groundlessness which dissolves matters and breaks down models. Thought, understood as pure determination or abstract line, must confront this indeterminate, this groundlessness. This indeterminate or groundlessness is also the animality peculiar to thought, the genitality of thought. Not this or that animal form, but stupidity. For if thought thinks only when constrained or forced to do so, if it remains stupid so long as nothing forces it to think, is it not also the existence of stupidity which forces it to think precisely the fact that it does not think so long as nothing forces it to do so? Recall Heidegger's statement, quote, "What gives us most cause for thought is the fact that we do not yet think." End quote. Thought is the highest determination, confronting stupidity as though face to face with the indeterminate which is adequate to it. Stupidity, not error, constitutes the greatest weakness of thought, but also the source of its highest power in that which forces it to think. Such is the prodigious adventure of Bouvard and Pécuchet, or the play of sense and nonsense. As a result, determination and the indeterminate remain equal and do not progress, the one always adequate to the other, a strange repetition which ties them to the wheel, or rather to the same double pulpit. Shistov saw in Dostoevsky the outcome of the critique of pure reason in the sense of both culmination and exit. Let us for a moment be allowed to see Bouvard and Pécuchet as the outcome of the discourse on method. Is the cogito a stupidity? It is necessarily a nonsense to the extent that this proposition purports to state both itself and its sense. However, it is also a confusion, as Kant showed, to the extent that the determination, I think, purports to bear immediately on the indeterminate existence I am, without specifying the form under which the indeterminate is determinable. The subject of the Cartesian cogito does not think. It only has the possibility of thinking, and remains stupid at the heart of that possibility. It lacks the form of the determinable, not a specificity, not a specific form informing a matter, not a memory informing a present, but the pure and empty form of time. It is the empty form of time which introduces and constitutes D difference in thought, on the basis of which it thinks, in the form of the difference between the indeterminate and the determination. It is this form of time which distributes throughout itself an I fractured by the abstract line, a passive self produced by a groundlessness that it contemplates. It is this which engenders thought within thought, for thought thinks only by means of difference around this point of ungrounding. It is difference or the form of the determinable which causes thought to function. In other words, the entire machine of determination and the indeterminate. The theory of thought is like painting. It needs that revolution which took art from representation to abstraction. This is the aim of a theory of thought without image. Representation, especially when it becomes infinite, is imbued with Representation, especially when it becomes infinite, is imbued with a presentiment of groundlessness. Because it has become infinite in order to include difference within itself, however, it represents groundlessness as a completely undifferentiated abyss, a universal lack of difference, an indifferent black nothingness. For representation began by connecting individuation to the form of the I and the matter of the self. In effect, for representation, the I is not only superior form of individuation, but the principle of recognition and identification for all judgments of individuality bearing upon things. Quote, it is the same wax, ... end quote. For representation, every individuality must be personal, I, and every singularity, individual self. I will repeat this because I was in parentheses and self was in parentheses. For representation, every individuality must be personal, I, and every singularity, individual, self. Where one no longer says I, individuation also ceases, and where individuation ceases, so too all possible singularity. Since groundlessness lacks both individuality and singularity, it is therefore necessarily represented as devoid of any difference. We see this with Schelling, with Schopenhauer, and even the first Dionysus, that of the birth of tragedy. Their groundlessness cannot sustain difference. However, the self in the form of passive self is only an event which takes place in pre-existing fields of individuation. It contemplates and contracts the individuating factors of such fields and constitutes itself at the points of resonance of their series. Similarly, the I in the form of a fractured I allows to pass all the ideas defined by their singularities, themselves prior to fields of individuation. Just as singularity as differential determination is pre-individual, so is individuation as individuating difference an anti-I or anti-self. I will side note, the anti here is spelled A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I. Does that change the meaning? Is this like upping the ante? I don't know. But I'll begin on this paragraph again. Just as singularity as differential determination is pre-individual, so is individuation as individuating difference an anti-I or anti-self. The world of one or they is a world of impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities, a world which cannot be assimilated to everyday banality, but one in which, on the contrary, we encounter the final face of Dionysus, and in which resonates the true nature of that profound and that groundlessness which surrounds representation and from which simulacra emerge. Parentheses, Hegel criticized Schelling for having surrounded himself with an indifferent night in which all cows are black. What a presentiment of the differences swarming behind us, however, when in the weariness and despair of our thought without image we murmur, the cows, they exaggerate, etc. How differentiated and differentiating is this blackness, even though these differences remain unidentified and barely or non-individuated. How many differences and singularities are distributed like so many aggressions? How many simulacra emerge in the night which has become white in order to compose the world of one and they? Now, side note, I'm going to reread that, and just to clarify, Deleuze has a way of talking about the differentiated in like three ways. There's a differentiated, just in like a general way. Then there's a differentiated. It has a C in it, and then there's a differentiated with a italicized T instead of a C. The italicized C version of differentiated, I'll say differentiated. Like I'm gonna really see like I'll see differentiated, right? So be aware that's what's happening. If I say differentiated, like I'm really hitting on that T, that's why, because the T is italicized there. The reason is unpacked in one of the other chapters. He does this because I think oh my gosh, if I remember right, differentiated is what's happening in the intensive and virtual. It's like a process of differentiation, whereas the differentiated with the T is it's been differentiated. I think it's in the extensive. Don't hold me to that, but it's something like that. That's close enough for now. Back to this parentheses. Hegel criticized Schelling for having surrounded himself with an indifferent night in which all cows are black. What a presentiment of the differences swarming behind us, however, when in weariness and despair of our thought without image we murmur, the cows, they exaggerate, etc. How differentiated and differentiating is this blackness, even though these differences remain unidentified and barely or non-individuated? How many differences and singularities are distributed like so many aggressions? How many simulacra emerge in this night which has become white in order to compose the world of one and they? End parentheses. The ultimate external illusion of representation is this illusion that results from all its internal illusions, namely, that groundlessness should lack differences, when in fact it swarms with them. What, after all, are ideas, with their constitutive multiplicity, if not these ants which enter and leave through the fracture in the eye? I will reread that last sentence because it's a question and I read it like it was not a question. What, after all, are ideas with their constitutive multiplicity, if not these ants which enter and leave through the fracture in the eye? That's a halfway point. I'm going to call it a night.